Before going any further, you deserve an explanation for what prompted me to produce these videos. You also deserve to know who I am, besides seeing my online handle below this video, of course, and what makes me qualified to present a video series on the subject of role-playing. Or, to be more blunt about it, here's the answer to the big question. Why should you bother to keep watching? After all, there are plenty of other really great video channels out there, several of which I've linked at the bottom of this video, that give lots of helpful advice on how to be a great game master. To provide answers to that question, I've made this introductory video, which should also give you an expectation of things yet to come as this video series evolves and unfolds. For over 30 years now, since the mid-1980s, I've been a role player, and for all but a very few of those years, I've been a game master. This started out because nobody else really wanted to do the job, but all the nerdy kids in my neighborhood still wanted to play, and somebody had to do it. So I hopped into the role. While I made a lot of mistakes, and I still do as part of the process of constantly learning and trying out new stuff in an effort to always improve, I seldom make the same mistakes twice, and I've had a lot of opportunities to explore a great many different game systems, gaming styles, mediums of role-playing, and methods for telling stories. I also discovered that I had a knack for being able to make up plots or threads of story for my players to follow, without necessarily railroading them into the direction I wanted them to go. But we'll get to more on railroading soon enough. In the course of all of the game mastering, I've played around with a variety of different game systems, some that I've enjoyed, some that I've loved, and others not so much. I started off my introduction to role-playing with Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition to be precise, though I'm still not entirely sure why they called it Advanced, except that I admit that to this day I don't really understand all the rules. Shortly afterwards, I was introduced to GURPS 3rd Edition by the son of one of my 5th grade teachers, and if he's listening now, I'm really, really sorry about what I did to your GURPS core rules, and also your mother's copy of The Once and Future King. I was a dumb kid, and I didn't realize that my backpack was such a hostile environment for softcover books. From those early beginnings, I've since had experience with 1st through 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, 1st edition Pathfinder, 3rd and 4th edition GURPS, TSR's Buck Rogers in the 25th Century and Marvel Superheroes, 2nd and 3rd edition Shadowrun, and most of White Wolf Publishing's Noun the Verbing games in the World of Darkness setting, composed of Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, Hunter, Wraith, Changeling, and Demon, and 2 of their near relatives, Exalted and Aberrant. And though I admit I'm a little ashamed to admit it, I've also done some LARPing. But if you don't know what that is, I'm not going to tell you. Additionally, in no particular order, I've had some serious fun with All Flesh Must Be Eaten, the definitive game for playing the zombie apocalypse, Big Eyes Small Mouth, which does indeed allow you to emulate most of the tropes from anime, Iron Crown Enterprises' Middle-earth role-playing system, or MERPS, as well as a few other games using their Rolemaster system, kind of a tedious game unless you enjoy referring to charts a lot, J. Snell Blair's Little Fears, which I think is just all manner of awesome, Palladium Books' Rifts, which pretty much everyone I've spoken to agrees has an awesome setting and really clunky rules, an assorted smattering of D20-based games, Slay Industries 2nd Edition, published by Nightfall Games, and which, while cool, really needs to quit hoarding the secrets of their setting. I mean, sheesh, guys. I'm going to buy your supplements anyway. West End Games' DC Universe, GDW's Dark Conspiracy, Mayfair Games' Underground, and the original version of The Whispering Vault by Mike Nistel and Pariah Press, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name. Besides all of those, I've got several shelves of other tabletop game systems and supplements that I haven't cracked open yet, but I will. Really. Someday soon, for sure. If I run out of other stuff to talk about, I might give you my reviews of each of those systems I've read through and played, one by one, though if I do, it will be under the heavy caveat I'm an English major, not a math or statistics or engineering or some other major that actually understands numbers. I mean, I scored pretty high on the math bits of my GRE, so I'm not a total dummy on the subject, but I'm nowhere near as good as it takes to get into the programs for the people who actually get math in a serious way. So, unless it's glaringly obvious, I'll likely overlook most of the complexities of the systems involved, except to say how tough or easy I found them to learn and use, and what immediate advantages and flaws I've noticed. Which segues into my education and profession. Outside of role-playing, adjacent to it actually, I'm also an academic, a teacher at the university level with an English degree and a rhetoric and composition specialty. So what does that mean? Rhetoric is the art of convincing people, of arguing well and breaking down all the fiddly bits that make up good communication. The composition part is putting all those little bits back together into something coherent and useful. Tied into composition, and linked to the ethical use of rhetoric, is something called dialectic, in which I am also trained. Dialectic is the art of doing research, of making darn sure that when you make an argument, you're making the right argument for the right reasons, after assessing all the available data, and while still being able to reassess when new data becomes available. In other words, you've got to be willing to admit you were wrong, and then start over. Mostly Ret Comp majors study the process of teaching and learning, especially teaching and learning writing, written communication methods and their relative effectiveness, technical writing, and folklore studies. The major intersects with a lot of other liberal arts and soft science majors by necessity, from psychology to sociology to communication to anthropology. So how does that tie back into role-playing? Well, role-playing games are a unique medium of storytelling. They're not stage productions, improvisational theater, or movies, and so a game master isn't a scriptwriter or a director. They're not traditional novels or other written stories, so a game master isn't an author. They're not video games, and so game masters aren't programmers or, again, scriptwriters. They're not part of the oral tradition of storytelling, like those of shamanistic cultures or campfire tale-tellers. Good role-playing games often incorporate many elements from all of those other mediums, but ultimately there's something completely different, and it is my personal opinion that we've only just barely begun to scratch the very edge of the possibilities that we have before us. As Gary Gygax, the grand pater of all role-playing games, once said, summing up what I believe makes role-playing games unique, the essence of a role-playing game is that it is a group cooperative experience. Of course, he also said role-playing isn't storytelling. If the dungeon master is directing it, it's not a game. I disagree with that second quote, but only to an extent. I believe that role-playing games are a medium of storytelling, but it's not just one person telling the story, like in those styles I've mentioned above. It's a shared experience, everyone at the table working together to create something more than any one of them could create alone. Once we begin to understand this medium of storytelling, then I think we can start to take more complete advantage of that medium and really unlock the power in our games. For me personally, these videos are a unique challenge of rhetoric and composition, of taking all those disparate elements that make for good storytelling and then putting them together into a coherent, easily understood medium. Ha! He said easily understood. So that's my reason for presenting these videos, to help you, the game masters, or those who want to become game masters, or those who want to help their game masters, start to understand some of the possibilities in this unique medium, and then to use role-playing games to develop fantastic stories of your own, you and your players working together to create something that none of you could have created alone. In the process, I also intend to develop my own understanding of role-playing games and how I can better tell stories through this unique medium. So, what will this video series be about, specifically? Glad you asked. One of the major foci of these videos will be on inspirations. Where do you get ideas? How do you turn those ideas into actual role-playing based plots? What sort of research should you do in order to really flesh out your plot? What resources do you have available in order to put together really compelling stories in conjunction with the efforts of your players? Once you've got your inspirations, I'll be discussing the idea of the three major elements of role-playing games, as centered on the three cornerstone games of the polyhedron of role-playing. The first of these, naturally, is the grandparent of tabletop role-playing games, Gary Gygax's good old Dungeons & Dragons. violence, which presented the idea of action above all. Not just violence, though that's certainly a big part of it, but the action that drives a game, even when plot might otherwise be lacking, as is often the case in a classic murder hobo dungeon crawl mashup. Second in chronology, as well as importance, is Steve Jackson Games' generic universal role-playing system, or GURPS, which created in its major sourcebook what is perhaps the most intense focus on character creation that I have ever seen, while later books gave a similar focus on building worlds and settings. In other words, character and setting is the second important cornerstone. Finally, White Wolf Games' storytelling games, started by Mark Reinhagen's Vampire the Masquerade, provided their contribution to role-playing games by introducing, or perhaps reinforcing, the idea of using them in a very explicit fashion as a medium for telling stories, for sharing overarching plots in a way that hadn't really been explored before. So that's the third cornerstone: plot and storytelling. So there will need to be videos on those three major elements: action, building characters and worlds, and on the art of telling stories through your games. Actually, I find thinking up stuff about plots and world building and characters and so forth to be pretty easy these days. If they aren't easy for you yet, don't worry, they will be. Just keep at it long enough, don't give up, keep on keeping on, and you'll get there. As for action, all I have to do is set up the scenario properly, then let my players have their head. And if we go into worlds of delightful, productive carnage, what fun! Well, there we are. What's hard, the really, really hard bit for me, is preparing plots, or those stories that help your party get from point to point in the overarching story, sequentially or in assorted order. So I'll be presenting videos on how to plan out A plots, B plots, and C plots, explaining what those are and what you need in order to be ready for whatever your players might throw at you. To give a short explanation of those terms, though, so as not to leave you completely hanging, A plots are those plots you've got planned out most thoroughly, because you're pretty sure that's the direction your players are going to take. The B plots are those little bumps in the road that provide impetus and connection between the A plot points, and also serve as side quests when your party needs something to do, or as alternative ways to get to the next A plot point. They're not usually fully fleshed out, but you've got most of the details in place, and just need to tweak them a little, and you're good to go. And then there are the C plots, which are what you've got ready when your backups for your backups have gone out the window and the party is completely off the chain, running amok in the game world in ways you never considered except in the most haphazard fashion. So the C plot is usually your delaying action. Those rough drafts you jotted down at 3 a.m. when you woke up from a pepperoni pizza nightmare and couldn't get back to sleep until you'd put down something in your notes. They probably won't have much body to them, but they're present, and if you got some time between game sessions, you can turn them into a full-blown A-plot when all else might fail. Random encounters also fall into the C-plot category, stuff that you've got waiting in the wings, which isn't essential to the plot, at least initially, but which might spark a lot more than you really expected, until your players may insist that some of that stuff make its way into the A-plot, or at least part of the B-plot. Speaking of plots, there will also be videos on the 3-act cyclic plot, in which you present your players with a hook, get them to and through an adventure, wind up with denouement and conclusion, and then launch them off into the next stage of the greater plot. So goes the continual cycle of plots, one after the other, ever building the story onward to the eventual conclusion of the campaign, in much the same fashion that many of your favorite shows on television build their plots, from episode to episode until finally reaching the season finale, wrapping everything up and preparing the audience for the next season, or, in your case, the next campaign. Oh, and by the way, you'll also need to consider your audience, i.e., your players, getting to know them, and tailoring the living story to meet their ever-changing needs, without going completely off the deep end. Unless that's what you all want to do, of course. One of the biggest elements of role-playing games that sets them apart from all other mediums of storytelling is that the audience members are also participants, co-authors, co-directors, and co-actors, right alongside the game master. The game master still takes on the bulk of the workload, which is why you're the primary audience for this video series, because it's a darn huge job. But whereas in all other mediums, there's a certain element of ultimate cosmic aloneness. In role-playing games, in order for the game's story to happen at all, there have to be participants. That is the fundamental requirement of the role-playing genre of storytelling. Considering your players' freedom of action also brings up the topic of the railroad versus the sandbox. These are styles of gaming that I've heard a lot about, and you probably have as well, usually describing the railroad as a bad thing, where the players are limited in their choices, and the sandbox as a good thing, where the players are only limited by what's around them in the world. Well, my response to that is, yeah, no. Be honest, do you really remember much about the plot of the Elder Scrolls series of video games? I really don't have any memories of Morrowind. But, oh well. That's about as sandboxy as a video game gets, or pretty close. And I've got to admit, I usually forget what the heck I'm supposed to be doing long before I hit the halfway mark. Conversely, old-school side-scrolling video games are about as railroady as you can get, but they're memorable, goal-oriented, and plot-centered, without requiring a great deal of effort from the players to follow the storyline. It's right there, on the other side of the screen. On the other hand, they also don't allow a lot of options for overcoming the problems you might face. You keep going forward, usually with a time limit to keep you from exploring too much, and your set of abilities are typically pretty limited as well. For example, Mario never does get far beyond his universal solution of jump on their heads, and if that doesn't work, throw a fireball, or hope for an invincibility star. So my personal recommendation for role-playing games is to emulate games such as Symphony of the Night, Final Fantasy VI, or the Borderlands series. These games use what I like to call the metro of player choice, with more options than a railroad, but more focus than a sandbox. Naturally, it's going to take at least a video discussing how to make a game like this, and possibly 2 or 3 to discuss all the nuances. Also, naturally, in any discussion of telling stories, whatever the medium, whomever your audience, the subject of Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces eventually comes up, and especially its hero's journey cycle. Adjacent to this cycle are the traditions of telling stories in the cycles of comedy, romance, tragedy, and satire, or irony. These are all old, well-known, widely accepted ways of telling stories which do have some success. But ultimately, they have to be heavily modified for the needs of this new medium of telling stories in role-playing games. In far too many instances, while they've got some fantastic ideas that you might mine for use in your game plotting, they just don't meet the needs of your present medium and audience in a role-playing game, and you're going to need some advice on how to adjust them to your specific needs, and when to just throw stuff out entirely when it's not working for you. Oh, and that's the last major piece of advice I've got before my conclusion to this video. Don't feel bound down by these points of advice. That's all I'm giving. Advice. Suggestions. In the end, you're the one who's telling the stories here. You and your peeps, working together to create something far greater than what any one of you could produce alone. As we go along, you should be thinking to yourself something like, yeah, that's a good idea, as well as, nah, don't like it, it's not my style. As you get more comfortable with being a game master and with role-playing in general, you should also get to know your voice and your preferences, and the combined voice and preferences of your players. Figure out your personal advantages and play them up. Figure out your weak spots and play them down, while at the same time carefully working to overcome them so that they cease to be quite so weak. And while you're working on yourself, start to take stock of what talent resources you have available through your players. Are some of them artists, good at optimizing characters, skilled at helping newer or less skilled players, good actors who might take on the roles of NPCs to give them unique voices and personalities that wouldn't have occurred to you, good strategists who you might rope into serving as a monster wrangler, taking some of the stress of running combats off your shoulders, just decent people who have a talent for making others feel welcome and relaxed and more willing to play nice with each other. Like I've already said before, role-playing is a unique setting, and the abilities of the group are far greater than the sum of the abilities of its individual members. Perhaps all of this seems like a lot to take in. Perhaps it is. Just remember, whenever you have doubts about yourself, about your role as a game master, about your ability to tell stories in this unique medium, or about anything else, you can do this. You're smart. You're creative. To paraphrase Lewis Carroll's Cheshire Cat, you must be, or else you wouldn't have come here. And to directly quote Douglas Adams, sharing some of the best possible advice in the universe, don't panic. In a related quote from Frank Herbert, fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. Take your fears, your anxieties, your insecurities, your doubts, and use them to drive you to become better. Seek out more advice, more videos, more articles, whatever. Hunt down more research material. Read a lot. Study a lot. Prepare as much as you possibly can. Then, when you've done all that you can possibly think to do, sit down at the game table and play. If this video seemed useful or interesting and you'd like to see more, please hit the like button. The same goes for the subscribe button, of course. And with all of that said and all of that done, I wish you all the very best.